I will never understand how one careless remark managed to ruin everything I built. People keep repeating his version of the story, as if I stood up in front of the world and declared my marriage worthless. When the truth is, it was only a joke that slipped out during a crowded moment. At his own birthday party, surrounded by friends and laughter, I compared the way he kissed me to how my ex once did, and I thought people would chuckle and move on. Instead, the air in the room changed, his face closed up, and by the end of the night he was gone. What shocked me most was not his reaction, but how fast he carried it beyond our home. He shared our fight with anyone willing to listen, turning whispers into judgment, and soon my name was dragged through conversations I could not stop. Neighbors gave me those pitying looks, colleagues whispered when I walked by, and even Marissa, my closest friend, decided to pull away. Everyone acted as if I had committed some unforgivable crime, when in truth, I only said what many women think but never dare to admit. I told myself honesty was better than silence, yet somehow that honesty left me standing alone, painted as the villain in a story I believed I had every right to tell. The night of his birthday party should have been one of those golden evenings that people look back on with warmth, yet for me, it became the dividing line between before and after. We were at one of his closest friends' houses, a large place filled with chatter, the smell of food, and the hum of music drifting between conversations. I remember standing there in my carefully chosen dress, feeling eyes on me the way I liked, noticing how people seemed amused by my quick remarks and easy confidence. I wanted to glow that night, to be seen as more than just Adrian's quiet wife, and in the beginning, I succeeded. People laughed at my jokes, asked me about work, and I relished the way I could steer the mood of the room. Adrian, of course, was his usual self, steady, polite, never the one to dominate a conversation. He sat with a small smile, sipping his drink, speaking when spoken to, content to let others lead. To me, that felt dull. I often told myself he needed me to add spark to his muted presence, that without me, he would fade into the background. So when the conversation turned toward relationships, trust, and whether partners truly understood each other, I saw a perfect chance to add flair. I leaned in, smirking, and mentioned how my ex used to kiss me differently, with more boldness, and how sometimes I wondered why things felt more restrained with Adrian. The words slid out lightly, almost playfully, but I knew the effect before the laughter even started. Some people chuckled awkwardly, others widened their eyes, and I felt a strange surge of power at having thrown something sharp into the safe circle of talk. The thrill made me reckless. I went on, elaborating in a way that I thought would keep it humorous, comparing the spark of the past with the calm of the present. To me, it was honesty dressed as wit, the kind of remark that made me appear fearless and real. In my mind, everyone should admire me for daring to say aloud what others only whispered in their private thoughts. Yet the air shifted quickly. Instead of admiration, I sensed discomfort. Friends who moments earlier were laughing now glanced at each other with unease. One or two looked directly at Adrian, waiting for his reaction. He gave them nothing. That was the worst part. He did not snap, did not joke back, did not even attempt to defend himself. He simply closed his expression, set down his glass, and rose from his seat. Without looking at me, he walked out of the room. The silence he left behind seemed louder than the music still playing faintly in the background. I tried to laugh it off, waving my hand and insisting it was just a bit of fun, that honesty was part of a healthy relationship, but I could see the whispers had begun. I hated the pitying glances more than the judgmental ones. Pity made me feel small, and I would not allow that. For the rest of the evening, I moved between groups with my chin held high, continuing to act as if nothing had happened. I told myself Adrian was overreacting, that he had always been too sensitive about appearances, that he would come back once he had cooled down. I told myself that the people whispering would eventually see me as bold rather than cruel. But inside, beneath the polished smile, unease crept in. I replayed the look on his face as he walked away, blank, unreadable, yet heavy with something final. When the party wound down, I left on my own. He had not returned, and no one knew where he had gone. I drove home with the same defiant voice in my head. He would be back, he would realize I had only spoken the truth, and he would accept that truth because he always did. At home, the bed was half empty, his side untouched, and the house felt colder than usual. Still, I refused to see it as a warning. Instead, I convinced myself I had done nothing wrong, that the problem lay in his inability to handle my honesty. I even told myself that when he returned, I would remind him how much worse it would have been if I had hidden such thoughts. I fell asleep alone, clinging to the belief that he would walk back through the door by morning. I had no idea that his silence was not temporary, but the beginning of a storm I would not be able to control. The next morning, I woke up expecting him to slip back into bed with that stiff politeness he sometimes used when he thought I had gone too far. Instead, the house felt hollow. His shoes were missing from the entryway, his jacket gone from the hook, and a strange stillness hung in the air. I told myself he had just gone for a drive, that he needed space, but as the minutes turned into hours, the unease grew sharper. When he finally came home, the weight in the room shifted instantly. He did not look at me the way he usually did. His eyes were steady but not soft, and he moved with the kind of cold precision that unsettled me more than if he had shouted. I tried to make light of what happened, insisting that it was only a harmless comment, the sort of joke couples make to keep things real. I told him he was being overly sensitive, that people would laugh about it later and forget. He stood there in silence, and the silence pressed harder than any words could. My instinct was to defend myself by reframing everything. I reminded him that honesty was supposed to be the foundation of marriage, that I had only spoken a truth rather than pretending. In my mind, he should have appreciated my candor instead of sulking like a child. But he did not melt the way he usually did. He began moving through the bedroom in measured steps, pulling open drawers, gathering his clothes. The sight of him folding shirts into a suitcase struck me harder than his expression. I tried to stop him with words, telling him he was turning something small into a catastrophe, telling him he was being dramatic, telling him I had no intention of hurting him. Inside, I was furious that he was making me feel guilty, but on the surface, I clung to the role of the misunderstood wife. Our children noticed the tension immediately. Ella asked me why Daddy was packing, her voice timid. I brushed her off, saying he was only going away for a little while. But inside, I hated how quickly the story was turning against me. My sister Corinne called later that day after hearing some version of events, and she questioned me gently, asking if I had really said what everyone was repeating. I told her it was exaggerated gossip, that people were twisting my words to make me look cruel. I could hear hesitation in her voice, and that hesitation stung more than outright condemnation. When Adrian finally zipped up the suitcase, the sound felt like a door slamming shut. He walked past me without raising his voice, without explanation, only a cold finality in the way he carried himself. I told myself he would be back, that this was just his way of punishing me temporarily. But the truth pressed at the edges of my confidence. He was leaving because of me, and the control I once had over the story was slipping from my hands. When I walked into work the following week, I felt eyes on me in a way that had nothing to do with admiration. Conversations broke off when I passed. Co-workers lowered their voices, and I knew Adrian had already begun spreading his version of the story. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that people were reacting to something else entirely, but by the time I checked my phone at lunch, I could not deny it. Marissa had sent a message saying she heard from someone that I embarrassed Adrian in front of everyone at his party. My stomach turned because I realized he had not just left the fight between us. He had carried it into every corner of our lives. I tried to control the narrative, insisting to Marissa that he was exaggerating, that he was insecure, and twisting what happened. I told her it had been nothing more than a joke that people were blowing out of proportion, that he was using it to paint himself as a victim. For a moment she seemed uncertain, but I could feel the ground shifting. Marissa had always been the one person I counted on to defend me, yet now she was asking quiet questions instead of rushing to my side. Her hesitation angered me, so I doubled down, painting myself as the one who had been wronged. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time from Elena, his mother. Her voice was sharp, accusing, telling me I had disrespected her son publicly, that I had humiliated him. I tried to argue, telling her she was biased, that Adrian had always been too controlling about appearances, that he was punishing me for being honest. But even as I said the words, I could hear her silence heavy with judgment. When the call ended, I slammed my phone down, furious that she had the nerve to scold me as though I were a child. The whispers at work only grew louder as the days passed. I decided to reclaim control by posting on social media. I crafted a long message about how people often judge without understanding, about how honesty in relationships can be misread as cruelty. I positioned myself as a woman who had simply spoken truth and was now paying the price for being bold. I ended it with a picture of myself smiling calmly, as if untouched by the storm. The likes came in, and for a few hours I felt triumphant, convinced I had reclaimed the upper hand. But my confidence shattered that evening when I checked my phone again. In the family group chat, Adrian had shared screenshots from our argument. His quiet words contrasted with my sharp ones, painted in a way that made me look ruthless. Seeing my own messages framed without context was like being cornered. Relatives who rarely spoke were now adding their opinions, siding with him, telling me I had gone too far. My chest tightened with anger and fear because it was no longer my private voice against his. It was evidence, frozen on a screen, spreading to people I could not reach. I told myself I could fix things if I showed up in person and explained, so I drove to Elena's house. It was the kind of place that always smelled faintly of polished wood and strong tea. A house where I never felt fully welcome, even when we were on good terms. As soon as she opened the door, I knew there would be no sympathy waiting. She didn't even invite me in with her usual politeness. She simply stepped aside with an expression that made me feel small, as though she had already decided I was beyond redemption. Inside, Adrian was sitting at the kitchen table with the children beside him. They were coloring quietly, oblivious to the weight in the room. But the way Ella leaned against him and Simon clung to his sleeve told me everything. They were aligning with him instinctively, sensing where the safety lay. I tried to greet them cheerfully, acting as if things were normal, but their eyes flicked toward their grandmother, waiting for her cue. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Elena wasted no time. She told me directly that I had crossed a line, that mocking my husband in front of others was not just unkind but cruel. I launched into my defense, claiming it had only been a joke, insisting that Adrian had always cared more about appearances than truth. I told her I was being punished simply for speaking honestly, and I even suggested that she was encouraging him to overreact. My words felt strong in my head, but as they echoed in that kitchen, they seemed hollow. Corinne had come too, and when I looked to her for support, she would not meet my eyes. She listened quietly, her hands twisting in her lap, clearly torn. She had always been my ally, but even she could not bring herself to defend me this time. The more I spoke, the colder the room became. Elena told me she was ashamed of how I had treated her son. Adrian said very little, but his silence carried more weight than any speech. When I reached out to touch his arm, he pulled back gently, not with anger, but with finality, and that quiet rejection felt like a blow. I reminded everyone that I was the one who kept the marriage lively, that Adrian had always needed me to add spark, but the words sounded desperate even to my own ears. Later, when I called Marissa hoping to vent, she didn't answer. Hours passed, and still nothing from her. My frustration grew into dread. Marissa had always been the one person who understood me, who laughed when others judged, but now she was vanishing when I needed her most. I scrolled through my phone angrily until I saw it. Someone had uploaded a short video from the party. It showed me smirking, leaning forward, making the comparison about Daniel's kiss, while Adrian sat beside me, expression frozen. The laughter in the background, followed by the silence when he stood up, was captured perfectly. No context, no defense, just a moment carved out for the world to interpret. Seeing myself from the outside was worse than I expected. The confidence I thought I radiated looked more like cruelty. The joke I insisted was harmless played like a public wound. Within minutes of the video spreading, Comments began piling up from people I barely knew. Some laughed, some criticized, but none of it was under my control. By the time the video circulated widely, I realized the story was no longer mine to shape. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes tracking me, not with admiration as before, but with quiet judgment. I convinced myself I could still salvage control if I confronted Adrian directly. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he would be at another gathering, a smaller one this time, just close friends. I was not invited, but that had never stopped me. If he was going to tell everyone his side, I would be there to challenge him. Walking into that living room felt like entering enemy territory. Conversations hushed, eyes darted toward me, and I caught fragments of whispers. Adrian sat in the corner, calm as ever, with Marissa on the sofa nearby. Her body language told me more than words. She was leaning away from me, angled toward him, listening closely as if she belonged to his side now. That betrayal cut deep, but I forced a smile, holding my head high, as though I was still the one in control. I started speaking before anyone could stop me. I told them they were misunderstanding, that Adrian had been twisting events because he couldn't handle a little honesty. I insisted Daniel had been nothing more than a passing reference, that I had no hidden intentions, and that the joke had simply fallen flat. I thought I sounded persuasive, but Adrian was ready. He reached for his phone, calm and deliberate, and pulled up messages I had sent to Daniel weeks before. They weren't dramatic, just playful, suggestive comments, remarks about what I missed or wondered about, but when read aloud, they became a weapon. He showed screenshots of me reminiscing about sparks from the past, of me telling Daniel I sometimes thought of him when life with Adrian felt too routine. I felt my throat tighten, but I couldn't show weakness. I told them Daniel was just a friend, that those words were misinterpreted, that everyone flirted harmlessly now and then. I painted myself as misunderstood, as someone being unfairly judged for small lapses that meant nothing. But as I looked around the room, I saw the shift. Friends who once laughed at my stories now avoided my gaze. They weren't buying it. The worst came from Marissa. She had been my confidant for years, the one who knew every detail of my private frustrations. I expected her to step in, to at least soften the blow, but instead, she looked at me with a weariness I'd never seen before. She said she could no longer defend me, that my words had hurt Adrian deeply, and that I wasn't owning what I had done. Her voice trembled slightly, but the firmness was unmistakable. It felt like a door closing in my face, louder than any argument. I tried to laugh it off, to suggest she was just siding with him to avoid conflict, but the faces around me told the truth. They were all with him now. Even Corinne, my own sister, stood off to the side, her eyes downcast. She didn't speak against me outright, but her silence felt heavier than words. For the first time, I sensed real isolation closing in. Then Adrian spoke, his tone measured but final. He said he had made a decision. He told everyone he was filing for separation, and he wanted them to hear it from him so there would be no confusion. His calmness unnerved me more than if he had shouted. He wasn't raging, he wasn't pleading, he was finished. The murmurs that followed wrapped around me like a net. No one rushed to my defense. No one tried to soften the announcement. It was accepted quietly, as though inevitable. I sat there, still pretending confidence, insisting to myself that he was bluffing, that he was trying to scare me into remorse. But deep inside, my certainty cracked. The room that had once been mine to command was now firmly under his control. The man I always thought I could manipulate had taken the narrative away, using my own words as evidence. And for the first time, I realized he might never give it back. When the announcement of separation settled into reality, I returned to the house that no longer felt like mine. The rooms echoed with absence, the stillness pressing down heavier with each day. At first, I told myself this was just a phase, that Adrian was testing me, trying to make me grovel so he could savor the moment. I convinced myself that silence was his strategy and that eventually he would return, ready to reconcile once I played the part of the apologetic wife. That was always our rhythm. I pushed, he retreated, and then he came back. But this time, nothing shifted. The children asked questions I could not answer. Ella looked at me with wide, searching eyes, asking why Daddy wasn't sleeping at home anymore. Simon clutched his toy car and asked if Daddy still loved him. I brushed their worries away with the same empty reassurances I gave myself. I told them Daddy just needed space, that he was busy with work, that everything would return to normal soon. But each night when I tucked them into bed alone, the lie weighed heavier. They clung to him when they saw him at school pickups or brief visits with Elena, and I hated how naturally their loyalty leaned toward him. They sensed something I refused to admit, that he had become the steady center, and I was the storm on the outside. I tried to reshape the story, just as I always had. On social media, I wrote posts about the value of truth, about how honesty was often punished by those who couldn't handle it. I crafted images of strength, smiling selfies with captions about growth and resilience. Some strangers applauded, but those who knew me remained silent. The likes that once came easily slowed to a trickle. Marissa had unfollowed me altogether, and Corinne stopped answering my calls as often. Even my own sister was slipping away, tired of being forced to choose sides. In private, I whispered to myself that honesty had been better than living a lie, that all I had done was speak openly. I repeated that story until it became a chant. Still, the evidence kept circling back. The video, the screenshots, the whispers. Everywhere I turned, my words followed me like shadows, twisted beyond my control. I hated Adrian for turning the world against me, but I hated even more the gnawing fear that perhaps I had handed him every weapon myself. Nights became the hardest. Alone in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the party over and over. I told myself I had been bold, not cruel, but the line between the two blurred each time. I thought of Daniel and wondered if he even cared that his name had become the spark for this disaster. Probably not. He had moved on long ago. I was the one still caught in the aftermath, bearing the weight of a joke that had turned into an avalanche. One evening, after another strained day of pretending to the children that everything was fine, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. I scrolled through old photos of Adrian and me. Smiles, vacations, birthdays that had once seemed unshakable. I wanted to send him a message, something sharp or clever, something that reminded him I was still in control. But my fingers froze. Every word I considered sounded either desperate or hollow. I closed the screen, telling myself he would regret leaving, that he would realize eventually no one else could match me. Yet the phone stayed dark. No message from him, no attempt to explain or reconcile, only silence. I kept waiting, night after night, convincing myself the notification would appear, that he would reach out and prove I still mattered. But the silence never broke, and the waiting became its own kind of punishment. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.